From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. A poison control center is the place to call if your child accidentally swallows something dangerous, like a detergent pod or paint. But the Rocky Mountain Poison Center in Denver also tracks the things that poison Coloradans. It monitors prescription drug misuse, tracks new substances Coloradans might ingest, and helps hospitals treat venomous snake bites. Dr. Richard Dart has led the center, which serves Colorado and 3 other Western states, since 1992. In that time, he's seen a lot of changes, from how the center handles phone calls to how it trains the next generation of toxicologists. Dr. Dart recently announced he's retiring, so we wanted to get a snapshot of how the things that sicken or kill Coloradans have changed in recent decades, and what drew him into an unusual line of work.
Well, my very first poison control call was when I was in training still, and I was working in the pediatric emergency department in Albany, New York, and a phone rang on the wall, and the nurse said, "That's for you." It was a red phone, and I said, "What is it?" She said, "Well, we're the poison center." And so I answered the call and helped this child. That's what hooked me, to be honest. That was very dramatic and very interesting, and you could make a difference right then.
Now, Colorado legalized cannabis during your tenure, both for medicinal use and later for recreational use. Talk about how that changed the type of calls that would come in.
Well, it certainly changed the number of calls. Cannabis is one of those drugs that a lot of people can use perfectly well, and other people have much more effects than they want to admit. And so our call volume went up dramatically. We often start special lines for states when they have something like this occur. So we created a cannabis line, and we were getting, at the beginning, hundreds of calls a day on the cannabis line.
Wow.
Even things like, where can I get good cannabis? But so we could help them, and we have ways of managing those calls so that we can handle that volume and help people. I think the most common one we get now that's an adverse effect would be repeated vomiting associated with chronic cannabis use.
Oh, yeah, scromiting.
Yes, yes. The cyclic vomiting that people don't believe it's due to the cannabis, but it is. And so it's very hard for them to stop. That's a very common one. And then acute psychosis is the other one, which is basically an acute break with reality that's usually caused by very high doses of cannabis.
I want to switch gears here because you were closely involved in the development of a better rattlesnake antivenom. Talk about how much of a difference this new antivenom has made for snakebite patients here in Colorado and in the West.
One of the more rewarding things for me is that back then, surgery was a common way of treating snakebite, which frankly is crazy, but that it happened. People would cut open bites. Surgeons would do major surgeries.
Wow.
Because they were afraid of the old antivenom, and they had a reason. It caused a lot of allergic reactions.
Okay.
Occasionally would actually kill a patient from the allergic reaction instead of from the snakebite.
Oh.
So the new product was much safer, and that's one of the major things it brought into the clinical realm. So today, it's very unusual to see surgical interventions, and what you see is much more antivenom use, which allows patients to recover from their bite much more quickly and go home and also recover.
Your work has also helped to shape national data collection on drug use, particularly with opioids. What are some of the big picture takeaways from the data you collected in Colorado during the opioid crisis?
I think one of the big contributions we made was, Americans like to blame things, and everybody blamed Purdue, who deserves some blame, obviously.
The makers of OxyContin?
Thank you. The makers of OxyContin.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very convenient way to abuse oxycodone, which is the active ingredient. What our research showed, and not just ours, many other researchers, but we were the first ones really to show that while that was indeed a problem, a much bigger problem were the generic forms of the opioids. So what people would know as Vicodin or Percocets. And the reason those were a bigger problem is because they're cheap. About 90% of the problem were these immediate release, easily crushable other forms and very cheap forms of opioids.
The Rocky Mountain Poison Center also began tracking a rise in something called polydrug use. This is where people who say they use one recreational drug also report using others. For example, cocaine and also LSD. It was once about half of people who reported polydrug use, but now it's more like 80 to 90%. Why has that number gone up so dramatically, and why is it useful to know that information?
Yeah. Well, we should clarify those numbers first. So those come from deaths, mortality that's reported to the CDC by medical examiners. And that's important because, 20 years ago or even 15 years ago, only about half of cases had polydrug involved in that death. And today it's much higher, as you were mentioning, which is probably one of the reasons why we have more deaths is because people are using more drugs. And when you use those, you can get interactions. For example, opioids depress your respiration, your breathing. So does Valium. And so if you take multiple drugs that depress your breathing, then you're more likely to die. That's one contributor to the mortality problem in the United States. I don't know why polydrug abuse has become so popular. We now do a lot of research on psychedelics, and we're seeing the same phenomenon in the psychedelic realm where people seem comfortable with taking 2, 3, 4 different psychoactive drugs simultaneously. And that's a recipe for disaster, frankly. You get drug interactions. The psychedelics are generally not very dangerous in the sense of like an opioid can kill you in minutes. Psychedelics don't do that.
Right.
But if you combine the two, then you can potentially have a problem. And so we're watching that very closely.
Well, think back on 34 years at Rocky Mountain Poison Center. I know. How have things that poison or kill Coloradans changed?
Wow, that's interesting. Be honest, humans are humans, and a lot of things haven't changed. Our most common calls are still from kids who get into things under the counter, right? The most dangerous calls are the opioids, and certainly that increased and is now maybe decreasing some. So that's one change. And then I think the one that's the most fascinating to me is the rise of the psychedelic medications because they potentially treat things that we in medicine don't have good treatments for. So that's great. But every drug has positive and negative aspects, and we need to understand how to use them safely.
That's Dr. Richard Dart, who's retiring as the head of the Rocky Mountain Poison Center after more than 3 decades there. He mentioned one other change he's seen, and that's the rise of AI. Nurses and doctors who answer patient calls can now use AI to help summarize and write their notes, which makes their jobs more efficient. We'll have a link to read more about Dr. Dart's career in our show notes and at KUNC.org. You can find lots more episodes of In The NoCo, including a recent interview with a snakebite antivenom researcher in northern Colorado. Find all episodes in our feed at your favorite podcast app. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.